So before we dive in today, we're going to have a quick review. It's been a couple of weeks since we've been together due to Resurrection Sunday and then Communion Sunday last week and so forth. And so thankfully, we're back together. If you remember, we've been talking through the role of the wife, the role that God has given to women in marriage. And that, of course, comes after we spent time talking about the role that God calls for men. But I want to just quickly remind us of one of the things we talked about last. And we talked about how in our world today, the idea of submission is often viewed with suspicion. And sometimes suspicion is even too charitable. It sometimes is viewed as an oppressive thing, an inherently evil thing, something that people with power force upon others to take away their dignity. And we talked about that reality, and then we held it up against the counsel of God's Word. And what we realized, if you remember, is that we looked through several different positions or stations that God gives to all different kinds of people, and we found that submission is actually simply part of the Christian life for everyone. It's not this exclusively oppressive thing that God has set upon women. It's something that we do as children. It's something that we do as citizens. It's something we do as employees. It's something we do as Christians altogether before God. And of course, also, it is something that God calls wives to do within the context of marriage. And so we saw that rather than the wife's role of submission being a less than role, we actually saw that it is a dignified Christ-like role. Jesus himself submitted his will to the Father. He put himself beneath the authority of the Father, accepting the will of the Father, fulfilling the plan of the Father. And that did not make Jesus less than. That revealed his glory. And it's a beautiful thing. And so it's right that as Christians we learn to see submission through the eyes of Scripture rather than through some of the talk and chatter of the spirit of our age. And so that was one of the things we talked about. Now, there's a lot more we covered, and we could review for a long time, but we're going to lead now into our final chapter on the role given to women. And really, this chapter focuses on the role of the wife, but there sure is a lot for us husbands to be thinking about in this chapter as well. So it really kind of feels like a blended chapter to me as I read it. But chapter 6 is on a woman's desire, the honor of another. And the main focus of the chapter, if you turn in your study guide to page 37, I wrote out a little statement there that I think captures the main focus of the chapter, and that's where I want to begin this afternoon. Let me read it to you. I wrote these words: "If you desire a better, more God-honoring marriage, then you must make the kinds of investments that promote the fulfillment of that desire. Tearing down your spouse will never build up your marriage." Now, you might think, Tom, I didn't really need to come here this afternoon to hear something so obvious. Everyone knows this. This is not rocket science. However, I cannot tell you how often I hear from people who are hurting in relationships, marriage being one type of that relationship, who are hurting in their relationship. And when you ask just a few questions, you find that, let's just take a wife, for example, you find that she's just constantly undercutting her husband. She's constantly nagging at him, complaining to him, cutting him down, reminding him that he's failing to meet her desires. He's not living up to her expectations. Meanwhile, coming to perhaps me or someone else saying, I just wish my marriage would get better. Do you really think it's going to get better while you're tearing your husband down? Does that make sense? Putting him down is never going to lead him to suddenly go, oh, you know what, I'm just going to suddenly flourish now that I'm in an atmosphere that's robbing me of any confidence or joy or a sense of love. The same can be true in reverse. If a husband is constantly putting down his wife or being uncaring toward her, those are not the kind of investments that lead to the flourishing of a relationship. And so oftentimes what happens in relationships is we actually are sabotaging our own growth in holiness and in maturity and in love by complaining bitterly and acting out with the things we're dissatisfied with, instead of approaching those things in a way that actually helps nurture a new outcome. Does that make sense? And so that's important because we're going to be looking here in just a few minutes at Ephesians 5:33, and you'll see how there's these two specific things that God sets forth for husbands and for wives. But before we look at those, let's look at question 1 here. The author opened the chapter on page 133 with an illustration from a silly car commercial. Who remembers the commercial? It was very, very short. The young lady in the commercial, she wants to sell her car, and apparently there's some kind of car wax that's for sale. And once she uses that on her car, suddenly it just gives it this whole new look, right? She takes the time to clean up her car and make it look nice, and in the process, she realizes, I like this thing. I don't want to get rid of this. I want to keep this. And the author brought this out to make a particular point. And I ask you in the notes here, what was the point which he drew out? And how does this apply to a marriage relationship, both positively and negatively? So what was the point that he was making from that illustration? That we love what we invest in. Have you found that to be true in your life? When we neglect things, the value of that thing is diminished. But when you have put in effort, when you've invested time or money or emotions, when you've made sacrifices for something, it is impossible for you to not have some kind of a vested interest now in that thing's success. Does that make sense? And so, to quote directly from the book, he says, we love what we invest in. When we give ourselves for the satisfaction, security, and development of other persons, we do more than build their self-esteem. We add to our esteem of them. And so we care more about what we invest in. And I actually just talked about this last night. I was talking with someone at the spaghetti dinner we had, and I looked to them and I said, you know the thing I love most about seeing our youth all serving tonight is that they don't realize it maybe yet, but now they're invested. They're now invested in the Pregnancy Network's success. They're invested in the cause of addressing the issue of abortion. They have invested themselves, even if they didn't realize they were. They're going to care now about how this goes. They're going to want to see a better outcome because they've given their time. They've poured their sweat in. And that's not only true in those things, it's also true in marriage. And so, positively, what does this mean? Well, it means this, that when I love and serve and invest in my spouse, I will grow in my own love for them and in my devotion toward the marriage and its flourishing. When you make investments, you will grow in your concern and your desire to see something healed. Negatively, it's also true. When I do not love, serve, or invest in my spouse, I will shrivel in my own love and in my devotion toward the marriage. And I think that if we reflect on our lives, anyone who's been married for any amount of time, you can probably recognize seasons in your life where both of these have been true. Times of investment where things have just really been flourishing, and then maybe some times of stagnancy or apathy, disinterest. And when you've kind of just given each other space, but not in a good way, and you allow things to come and you start to lose interest. The author said one more quote I want to read to you from page 134, particularly applying this to wives, although as I said, I think this goes both ways. He said, when a woman supports and affirms her spouse, her love for him deepens. The regard she gives not only expresses her love, but also builds it. When she withholds regard, her love diminishes. And so this is all setting us up to come to a particular portion of the text of Scripture that we've been looking at, which is Ephesians 5:33. And you see that right below on page 37 here. While this verse is succinct, it highlights a major feature of both the husband's and the wife's call in the marriage relationship. Let me read these words to you. And this is his concluding remarks on marriage. He says, however, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. So first off, very simple. If you're a shy person, this is your question. What are the two things he's pointing out? What is it that he's chiefly pointing out for husbands, and what is he chiefly pointing out for wives? Love and respect, yes. Now that sounds very simple, doesn't it? And yet, I really believe that if we take time to contemplate those two things, there is tremendous wisdom in even that simple statement for us to glean. Commenting on this verse, the author said, Paul seems to deal with each gender at its weak points. How is this true for men and women, respectively? And I asked you to write your answers on the next page. So, men especially need to be called to love their wife because what? Yes. Yeah, so Wayne said that it is common for men to try to dominate their wives, either by abusing their position or their power or even their physique or other kinds of things. So the abuse of their role as the head of the family is something that sinful men are common to do in one way or another. And so men need to be reminded that they need to love their wives as they love themselves. They need to love their wives with a sacrificial love, because in our sin, men are often tempted to not relate to their spouse that way. What about for women? Women especially need to be called to respect their husband because why? Yeah, well said. Very well said. Yeah, and the author said the same thing in using these words, that a woman's temptation is often to use the power of words and emotions to shame her husband into doing as she wishes. And so you can see how there can be tension. Now, is this a generalization? It absolutely is. Are there exceptions to the rule? Yes. Sometimes personalities are a bit different in certain ways. But generally speaking, I think this really is a very helpful rubric. And most of all, we can trust it because it's biblical. This isn't just some person coming up and saying, I think love and respect are two great ideas. This is God Almighty in His Word, His inspired Word, saying, listen, husbands, you need to love your wives with a selfless and sacrificial love. Focus on that. Aim at that. And secondly, also saying to wives, respect your husbands. Treat them with the kind of respect that God would call you to. Now, question 3 here. The author recounted the sad details of his former neighbor who engaged in an abusive cycle of behavior with his wife and children. The key thing to reflect on from this story is the word pattern. While your marriage may not reflect the same level of severe dysfunction described in this story, and I hope that it doesn't, and if it does, please reach out to one of us. But perhaps you would say there are, nevertheless, destructive patterns of behavior that have formed in the way you and your spouse relate to one another. The author succinctly captured what is typical of most marriages, saying, a man will try to dominate a woman with strength. A woman will try to control a man with... And the thing that we need to really emphasize here is this idea of trying to control. I want to really ask you to think with me about control and how that might have crept in to your marriage relationship in a way that's very unhealthy, because it is extremely common at varying levels and varying degrees for relationships to start to drift toward a controlling type of dynamic rather than a serving and a selfless, loving dynamic. What are examples of ways that a husband might try to dominate a woman with strength? I asked you to list some. What comes to mind for you? Intimidation, yeah. Feel free to shout them out. Shouting, there you go. Yes. Yes. Intimidation and shouting. What else comes to mind? Yeah, so let's elaborate on that. So body language, right? Men can be very domineering in their body language, using shouting, using sort of standing in a doorway. I'll use an example from my marriage. When Mary and I were first married, and we had times where we would argue, Two things. One, I would raise my voice way too often and way too quick. And two, not thinking, I wasn't doing this intentionally, but it just so happened on a few occasions I was standing in the doorway for her to be able to exit the room as I was raising my voice and shouting in a sinful way. How do you think that made my wife, who was like 110 pounds, feel? Probably not very safe. Probably not very loved. Now, had I thought all that through? No, I was too immature to think all that through. But I needed to grow up and learn that, wait, the way I handle myself matters. And I need God to sanctify me and teach me how to love my wife better. And so, yes, fear is another thing. Another example of ways of fear is not only in the physical sense, but also in a threatening sense of abusing our position. What does it look like for a husband to potentially try to use fear to control his wife by abusing his position? What are some examples that might look like? Yeah, so if he happens to be either the sole income for the family or the majority income for the family, he might try to use that coercively. What are some other ways? What about forcing decisions on your spouse that your spouse is very much opposed to? That could be another way, right? What about trying to bring children into the middle? And trying to play that triangulation where, well, my wife doesn't want this, but I want this, and so I'm going to give this to my kids in front of my wife to show my kids that I'm really the good guy. Does that make sense? All kinds of things like this that can be very, very destructive. And when you bring the kids in, it's even worse because it's not only between you and your wife now, but you're even bringing that kind of destructive behavior into your kids' lives. Next question I have here are, what are examples of ways that a wife might try to control a man with shame? I asked you to list some here as well. Criticism, that's a big one. Yes, also a big one. Can you explain that one just a little bit? Thank you. And I want to tease these out. We can add more, but I want to tease these two out for just a second. Criticism can take place in lots of ways, right? So it can take place privately just between you and your husband, which can still be hurtful when it's not done as a loving thing to be helpful. But it also can take place where you can be bringing up past mistakes or criticizing publicly. And by publicly, I mean you could be doing that in front of the children. You could be undercutting your husband's authority in front of the kids or questioning him in front of the kids in a way that makes him feel embarrassed as a leader. Also, with his friends or with your friends at church, or maybe your husband is anxious all day every Wednesday because Wednesday's women's Bible study night and he doesn't believe that you're going to honor him among the other ladies because he's heard you speak poorly about him. Does that make sense? There's all kinds of these things that can undercut the foundation of your marital relationship when they're not managed in a proper way. So when a wife is not respecting her husband, or when a husband is not loving his wife, breakdown is always going to occur in the marriage. Are there any others that you might put? Can I get an amen, brothers? Just kidding. Kind of. Yeah, words of affirmation matter, and that's both ways, right? I mean, people want to know that they're valued. I'll give you an example. I'll be vulnerable. And this is a silly example for you. Feel free to laugh, but it's real life. Yes, the day before yesterday, I was not driving. I was working on our minivan because multiple of the headlights bulbs had gone out. And it gets really dark on the way home to our place in the country. So it was not super safe to drive at night. So I bought headlights, and I was trying to fix them. And if you know anything about modern cars, it is not made to be worked on. It's made to look pretty, which is nice until it needs work done. And you can't fit these big old mitts anywhere. So finally got 3 of the 4 light bulbs replaced. The last one just would not go in. It still actually isn't in great. It's kind of dangling there. Don't tell anybody. But the light bulbs are working awesome. And do you know what? So last night when we're driving home from the spaghetti dinner, it's the first time I'm in the car with my wife. It's nighttime, and you know what I'm waiting for? I'm waiting for her to go, honey, you're the man. This is great. We all crave that, right? And that's just one silly example, but we want to know that we're appreciated. Wives want to feel that. Husbands want to feel that. And so that's a powerful thing when it's withheld, isn't it? It's hard when we don't tell our spouse, good job, or I appreciate you. I recognize your sacrifice or your commitment. So those are important things. Question 4. Sadly, all these things we've been talking about, both with men and women, sadly, these factors often become cyclical. What does the author mean by this statement? When he says that when we mistreat each other, it often becomes cyclical. What does he mean by that? Mm-hmm. Yeah, very well said. Yes. So one way you could put this is that sin begets what? That's right. You already knew. So when a husband or a wife is mistreating the other, that does not give an excuse for the other spouse to retaliate or to respond in sin. That is no excuse. That person is still responsible to do what is right in the sight of God. But it sure makes it a lot harder for them, doesn't it? And it makes it much more likely that they too will begin to participate in sin by trying to fight back, by trying to use wrong forms of behavior, wrong ways of communication, wrong actions to try to control back. And it ends up tearing each other down again and again. Sin begets sin in relationships. So let's say, and this could start either way, so I'm not picking on either role, but let's just say a wife is just constantly nagging at her husband, and that husband is constantly blowing up with anger in that relationship. Do you think there might be a relationship between those two behaviors? They're not just these mutually exclusive events, are they? They're each throwing fuel on the fire of the other. They're not promoting holiness, they're promoting sin in one another. And so it's good for us to identify those patterns. They're not going to be the same for every couple. They're not identical in every marriage. But there are ways that husbands in the room, there are ways that you need to hear and contemplate Ephesians 5:33. How are you loving your wife well? And wives, vice versa, how are you respecting your husbands? And maybe you should ask yourselves, wherever there's some dysfunction in our marriage, even if it's just a little dysfunction, even if it's not in some horrible place, but wherever there's some dysfunction, is there a cyclical pattern here? Is there a way that I am actually throwing fuel on the fire of the thing I hate? Is there a way that the investments I'm making are actually counterproductive to the outcome I desire? Does that make sense? And so sin begets sin, and this is definitely an overgeneralization that you could accuse me of being cheesy here. First you have to accuse me of not knowing how to spell, but then you can accuse me of being cheesy, but you'll get the point that I'm making. Love begets change. Sin begets sin, but love begets change. And what I mean by that is that when you stop keeping sin in circulation, when you stop it and say, you know what, I'm not going to pass it back to you. I'm going to forgive you as God has forgiven me, and I'm going to love you with the love that God has loved me with. Do you know what happens in the marriage? Do you know what happens to a fire that you stop putting fuel on? It goes out. It can't keep burning unless there's something for it to burn. And so when a spouse begins to allow the gospel to change the way they relate to their spouse, instead of their anger dictating how they relate, or their selfishness, or their bitterness, or their upset, when they let the gospel shape the way they begin to relate to their spouse, you can actually begin to seek real change, real growth, real health in the marriage. Does that make sense? Okay, turn with me to page 39. Little quote here. We'll talk just a little bit more about this. When this cycle is in effect to any degree, the marriage becomes a daily tug of war for power. Power may be expressed through intimidation or manipulation. Control measures may take the form of screaming or scheming, silence or secrecy, whining or withdrawal, violence or victimization. Whether the means are active or passive, the goal of each of these behaviors remains the same: controlling the other person. And what I asked you to do on this question is to circle the words in the quote above that most closely describe the destructive patterns which have been present in your marriage. And I want you to notice how I worded that. Two things to note. One is most closely. None of these words may be exactly descriptive. I get that. We are complex creatures. So most closely is one part I want you to notice. The second is which have been present, not which might have been. You are all sinners, and so am I, and we need the Lord Jesus. I already know that certain destructive patterns are present in your marriage because you need the Lord like every other person. And so praise God if they're not in a horrible place. But nevertheless, where do we see certain tendencies like this in our marriages? And then I asked you, as you and your spouse have engaged against each other in these kinds of sinful ways, what effects has this had on your relationship? So when you have acted out with intimidation or raised voices or harshness or some kinds of fear or coercion, or wives, when you have been critical or nagging or undercutting your husband's authority, how's that gone? Has that made everything better? When you have retaliated against your spouse or acted out against your spouse, has that fixed the problem that you were frustrated about? The answer is obvious, right? But this is the very thing I was saying at the beginning of the chapter. And let me just go back and actually just read it. If you desire a better, more God-honoring marriage, then you must make the kinds of investments that promote the fulfillment of that desire. Tearing down your spouse will never build up your marriage. So let's give an example for a moment. If I am angry at something my wife is doing, whether it's just a disappointment or whether it's a blatant sin in her life, or vice versa, she's angry with me for the same thing, I have a choice, don't I? I can either respond in kind and try to control the relationship and force the relationship to be what I want, or I can ask God to give me the grace to love her like He loves me, even though right now, humanly speaking, she has not earned that love. Or vice versa, I haven't earned it. Does that make sense? Those are the two choices. And we can complexify that as much as we want. We can sort of try to make it as confusing as we can to get ourselves out of it, but that's really what it boils down to at the end of the day. We have two choices. We are either going to love our spouse out of the flesh and therefore probably not love them very well, or we're going to ask God to help us love them according to the word of truth and the power of the Holy Spirit, and let the gospel be the pattern for our relationship. Does that make sense? Okay. Follow me on page 39 down to the next section, which is titled, For His Sake. In contrast to selfishly vying for control over the other, God calls husbands and wives to love one another with Christ-like love. That is, to devote themselves to one another with a selfless, sacrificial service that genuinely seeks the other person's best interest, and that is regardless of how worthy that person is of such treatment. This calling requires a vast number of considerations, but God has given wives a particular focus by especially calling them to respect their husbands. In question 6, concerning this, the author notes, women may not recognize how much husbands are affected by their wives' respect or lack of it. Women may not recognize how much husbands are affected by their wives' respect or lack of it. Not only does a wife's respect build up the marriage, it also builds up the husband and enables him to be all that God designed him to be. Now, I asked for some reflection on the next 4 bullet points here, and I'd love to hear some of the thoughts. Wives, how are you showing your husband the respect you have for him as your leader? Make a list, including words, actions, etc. Now, this is a helpful question, I think. What came to mind for you? What are some specific ways that you seek to show your husband respect, to show him that you respect him as your leader? What came to mind for you, ladies? That's a great one. Yes. So appreciation. Yes. Well said. What else? Okay. Appreciation, seeking counsel. That's supposed to say counsel. Words of affirmation. We'll just shorthand that one. What else comes to mind? Yeah, I'll just put that under the heading of serving him, right? Is that okay? Yeah, excellent. What about trusting? Have you ever been in a position, not even just in marriage, but have you ever been in a position of leadership where someone who was under your leadership in a given situation did not trust you? They did not trust that you were able to lead well, and every time you tried to lead them anywhere, they were questioning you, they were challenging you, they're sort of like kind of standing at a distance, pulling a different direction, maybe even talking with other people behind the scenes. It's incredibly difficult to lead when people who are following your leadership refuse to trust you. Now, if they have good reason, that's different. We got to work on, okay, what have I done to lose that trust? But I'm just talking about just general distrust. Wives, trusting your husband's leadership and helping him to know that you trust him. And that you trust him even if he makes a couple mistakes, you trust that he'll learn from them and try to make it right. That will go so far in helping to encourage and build up your husband and to help him feel respected. What about interest? It's easy in life, especially perhaps, I guess I can't really speak beyond the time of raising children because I haven't got to that season of life yet, but I think it's especially easy while raising kids to get into a rhythm where your life can be so busy that you actually stop being interested in each other's lives outside of the parenting scene. And so a husband might come home from work or vice versa, and there's no conversation about how was your day, what are you working on, how are you developing, what challenges are you facing at work, what are some successes you've had. A lack of interest in each other really translates down to not really valuing that other person. Does that make sense? And if that goes on long enough, the distance in the relationship will grow, and the sense of respect, the sense of being admired by your wife will go with it. I already pointed this out earlier, but also being impressed by your husband. Do you show that to him? Do you tell him, honey, you're great at this. You really did a good job on X, Y, or Z. Man, you fixed that thing that was broken, and I could have just never done that. That feels really, really upbuilding to a husband to hear. And of course, it feels that way both ways. But those are ways that you can build up your relationship. And I want to just add this before we go to the next question. This may feel small. Some people hear these kinds of things and they're like, so just be a nice person? I mean, that's going to help my marriage get better? Yes, it will. It absolutely will. So often we think that we just are waiting for some magic bullet that's going to change it. Most of the problems that we face are overgrown small problems. They are small problems that we allowed to keep growing and growing. If you go into the forest right over there and you find a sapling, do you know what you can do? You can grab that thing and rip it right out of the ground. 30 years from now, if you let that thing grow, you better bring an axe and a chainsaw because you're not getting it up without a big fight. What's the difference? It was allowed to grow. What are you letting grow in your marriage? What have you not plucked up when it was young and dealt with and is now an oak that's towering over your relationship? Behavioral patterns and communication patterns, they matter. Okay, positively here, or negatively here, we've talked about some positives. Wives, I asked you to reflect negatively as well. How have you been showing your husband disrespect for his leadership? Say it again. Blaming. Thank you for the humility to go first. I was expecting to not have very many volunteers on this one. Yeah, blaming. What else comes to mind? Criticism. Thank you for your humility. Defensive. I've never been defensive in my life. What else? Questioning. And of course, we could add to the list, and I think if we searched our hearts, we all could consider a few more, but this is a good place for us to just go, you know what? Let me just stop and think about, am I showing my husband the kind of respect that Ephesians 5:33 calls me to? Am I taking time to consider how my words and actions are going to affect him and affect him as my leader? Husbands, I asked you to consider a couple things as well. The author mentioned that there have been key moments when his wife's respect has meant everything to him. In what ways has this been true for you? Now, we have more ground to cover today, so I'm not going to stop and hear the stories now, but here's what I want you to do. Husbands, tell your wife about whatever that story is. Tell your wife about it tonight. Tell her thank you for how her respect has blessed you at some point in your life. Whether it was years and years ago or just this week, it could be even a small thing. But take a minute to tell her, because one of the things we also forget is, and let me back up, I have been guilty of this in my marriage on more occasions, like so many occasions that it's embarrassing. Sometimes when my desires are not met in marriage life in some way, some desire, some want that I have of certain words of affirmation or encouragement here or some support there, something I've wanted my wife to do that hasn't come through. I usually not only assume that she will do that, but then I also assume that she knew I wanted her to do it. And so then I'm doubly frustrated. The problem is that's completely unfair. I never asked her or told her that I wanted it in the first place, and I'm holding her accountable for not reading my mind and knowing it. Does that make sense? So when I say go home and tell your wife this story, what I'm saying is communication will help. Your wife probably really, really wants to respect you well and to build you up. He may not, or she may not know exactly how or what your needs really are. Maybe she's working really hard to do that over here in this category, and it's just not your language, and you're completely missing that. And so it's good for us to dialogue about these things and to share. Finally, husbands, without indulging bitterness or harboring any intent to hurt your spouse, how has your wife's lack of respect for you and for your leadership in the family affected you? Now, I don't want anybody in the doghouse or sleeping on the couch tonight, so I'll answer this one generally for all of us. Some of the ways that I know men are affected by a lack of respect from their wife is that it can make them feel weak. It can make them feel afraid, disempowered, alone, ashamed, inadequate, indecisive, unwanted, unappreciated, uncertain about the future of their marriage, and all these kinds of emotions. And this is not just true of sensitive guys. This is also true of men who don't express their emotions very much. They feel all of these kinds of things too, even though they may not ever tell you. And I don't think any of those are the kinds of ways that we would want our spouse to feel. I don't think we could define that as being a loving spouse if we are making our spouse feel that way. And so just let me encourage you, ladies, think about as many ways as you can to help show respect and to build up your husband as God calls you to. Next page, page 40. Just as a husband's failure to love his wife can lead to devastating effects, so a wife's failure to respect her husband can do the same. And you'll notice this next part is underlined. I want to make very clear there are no excuses for sin, but I want you to hear this. To be very clear, let me say a wife's failure to respect her husband does not ever justify her husband's sin or vice versa. Okay, we're not saying that anybody gets a pass just because somebody upset them. However, concerning this reality, the author rightly notes, a wife who does not understand that God designed husbands to thrive through respect too often discovers that her husband will find other sources for the respect he requires. I think the word requires is a bit strong, the respect that he deeply desires and craves. Question 7 then, what are examples of, quote, other sources where a husband might sinfully seek the fulfillment of his desire for respect? And I ask you to list them. What comes to mind here? Work. I think I heard one other one as well. Others. And I'm going to go ahead and say it because we need to deal with reality. Other women. I want to reiterate what I underlined above. I am not saying that that man has any excuse whatsoever, but I am saying that a marriage where two people are not loving each other as they are supposed to, loving each other as God calls them to, it leaves both of them more vulnerable to the many temptations of this world, the many evils of this world. And again, no excuse for it, but it does make them more susceptible to it. What are some others? Hobbies. Yes. Possessions, money, toys. Even good things. There are many times where people become overly devoted to serving in the church even as a way of compensating for some major gaps in their home life. And so it's something that we always have to be careful of, is that even good things, when they're done in the wrong way or for the wrong reasons, can become difficult patterns in our lives. I asked you next to think, have any of these things been present in your marriage? If so, which ones and in what ways? Now, I don't want us to answer that here publicly in this group setting, but I hope that you maybe would take time to reflect on it. Because the struggles that people face in their marriages, and we all face them, those struggles don't come out of nowhere. That's why we've been building up throughout this chapter to think about what kinds of behaviors sometimes do we fall into that are not helpful for our marriages. How do those create those patterns? And now we're starting to think, what are some of the outcomes of those patterns when they are not properly addressed? Question 8. On the bottom of page 138, the author wrote, "A man's need never excuses his betrayal, nor does his guilt prove his wife's neglect. But the woman who loves her husband and wants to guard their marriage from sin strives to make her regard for her husband his lifeline to self-respect." The author then lists several ways that a wife might be the champion of her husband's respect. I asked you to list them below, and then circle the 3 which you believe would be the greatest additions to your marriage relationship. Before we list those, I want to just point something out that Ron Bano was very thoughtful and helpful in recognizing. Throughout the chapter, the author regularly referred to a man's desire for respect as a man's need for respect. And I think Ron was very thoughtful in pointing out that that's not really the best way to put it, because a need means you can't do without. And a man who's not receiving respect from his wife, or at least the kind of respect he desires, is still called in every way to be the Christian husband that God has called him to be. So just a semantical thing there, but still an important recognition that need, while we know what the author is getting at, is probably not the most careful or best way to express that. But it is something that is a very deep desire in which he flourishes. So I asked you to list here, what are the ways that a wife can be the champion of her husband's respect that the author lists in the book? Yeah. Showing interest in his career, cheerleading his ambitions. What else is listed there? Honoring his decisions. Excellent. You guys are in sync. What else? Yeah, admiring his physical appearance. Yes. It's easy to be very critical, isn't it? I mean, let's just really quick, show of hands. Do you find it easy to be critical and to notice the shortcomings of your spouse? Yeah, it's very easy. Your spouse needs to know that you also see that they're trying, that you see that they're aiming to do well. They need to hear those kind and upbuilding words. So I asked you to choose 3 of those and to just kind of highlight some things that you might try to incorporate in the fabric of your relationship, and I hope that you were able to do that. Next section, for her sake. The author makes an incredibly important point, and an incredibly important and often overlooked point concerning the way that each spouse's obedience to their God-given role not only blesses their spouse, but also blesses themselves. When we conform our life to God's will and God's ways, we are living the very best life that we can live. Husbands and wives find their fullest and best life in obedience to God, regardless of their spouse's responses. Conversely, it is also true that a husband or a wife who rejects God's ways not only sabotages the spouse they have vowed to love, but they also sabotage their own happiness as well. In marriage, as in all of life, the seeds we choose to sow are the fruits that we will eat. The harsh shall reap the bitter. The loving shall reap the sweet. What point is the author making through the quote below? All Christian women must remember that the corrupted values of our world tempt each heart to desire control. Peace will not come to any marriage until each partner seeks to serve rather than to sway the other. The service that brings a wife fulfillment begins with the recognition that the love for which her heart longs cannot flourish without the respect for her husband that God requires. So what is the author teaching us through that quote? Yeah, excellent. How else might we put that? Yeah, well said. Yeah, and so that kind of brings us back to that opening statement. Do you remember? That if you desire to have a better, more God-honoring marriage, you have to make the kinds of investments that promote that outcome. And if you're at one hand, you're saying, I want a better marriage. My husband or my wife is, frustrating me here or there. And then you go home and you nag them and you pick at them and you criticize them for what they're doing. It's not going to get better, is it? You can do that all day long, and you're never going to suddenly snap into a position where you go, aha, we figured it out. Everything's all better. You're only going to be throwing fuel on that fire, as we discussed earlier. Top of 41, question 10. Many women wish that men could understand how important their acts of love and gestures of affection and tenderness are to their heart, and rightly so. However, on page 142, the author says, in a similar way, I wish that women understood a man's confidence of his wife's respect is the ground on which he plants his feet to meet life's challenges. As a husband's assurances of his love provide a wife security and comfort for her trials, her respect is his fortress. The firmer the ground of his wife's respect, the more able the husband is to react with proper strength or tenderness to his challenges. The respect a wife shows her husband secures her marriage in ways more powerful than most women or men fully comprehend. And then I ask this, what powerful effects is the author suggesting that the wife's sincere respect for her husband has on, and there's these 3 categories, on the man himself? On the man, a wife's respect gives that man strength, confidence, and security. And particularly, I like what the author said when he said, the firmer the ground of his wife's respect, the more able the husband is to react with proper strength or tenderness to his challenges. You see what he's saying there? He's saying that when a wife is doing her best to love her husband as God calls her to, with respect, that man is going to be in a better position to actually return the kind of love that he's called to give to her. As where if she's treating him disrespectfully, it's going to be much more likely that he's going to respond in an agitated way, in a harsh way, in a bitter way as well. On their marriage, what effect will it have when a wife shows respect? Their marriage together will be sweeter, stronger, more loving, and more stable. And therefore, ultimately, the wife, by respecting her husband, not only strengthens her husband, sweetens her marriage, but also she then herself, as a byproduct, is going to be blessed. And this is something we saw last time we were together as well with submission. Submission, we are told, will take life from a wife. If you really want to have the fullness of life, women, don't submit. That's oppressive. And yet what we saw when we looked at the Bible is that actually trusting God's ways and submission will bring you into flourishing and fullness of life. The same is true here. Respecting your husband, treating him the way God calls you to, actually makes the investments and lays the foundation for the kind of marriage that all of us in the end truly desire to have. Question 11 is very important. On page 144 and 145, the author recognizes an important question. What should I do if my husband is undeserving of my respect, much less my reverence? To answer this question, we need to start by asking another one. Who is a wife ultimately respecting and revering when she obediently chooses to respect and revere her husband? What's the answer? Ultimately, her obedience there is to the Lord, because it is God who calls wives to respect and husbands to self-sacrificing love. So the next question then is this: how does the recognition that a wife's respect for her husband ultimately stems from her love for and submission to God free her to respect her husband even when he is unworthy of that respect? How does this truth give us strength in the midst of very difficult times in marriage? Yeah. Could you say that one more time for everybody to hear?
Her obedience doesn't hinge on the actions of the husband, good or bad, strictly out of obedience to God.
Well said. So a husband's love for his wife does not look like this, does it? Because he is a sinner who needs God's grace, it looks a little more like this, right? Hopefully, we can get closer and closer to hitting the mark consistently as God helps us. But the reality is that we fluctuate. We don't all have good days every day. We're not always at our best. We have moments of weakness and struggle. And so the reality is that if a wife's respect for her husband is based on her husband's performance, what's going to happen to her respect? It's going to look just like this, right? It's going to go up and down and up and down. Well, what's going to happen to a marriage that's like that treats each other the way the other person deserves to be treated? How's that going to go? It's just going to disintegrate, right? It's going to turn into all kinds of dysfunction. And this is why, and I want to make this point as emphatically as I can, this is why Christian marriage is a good thing for all kinds of people, but Christian marriage, where God is at the center, is the only marriage that can truly flourish. Why is that? It is because it is the only marriage that can be freed from this kind of trap. Why is it the only marriage that can be freed from that trap? Because in Christian marriage, the way that a wife relates to her husband and the way that a husband relates to their wife is not based on the performance of either party. It is based on who God is and how God has related to us. So instead of us saying, well, I'll treat you good today, but I'm going to treat you bad tomorrow, I'll treat you good then and bad then, and then vice versa for the husband to the wife, instead of that, while husbands or wives, they can have highs and lows, the gospel helps us say, because I trust God's ways, And because my own heart is full of God's love, I am going to continue to aim to love you consistently, purely, unconditionally. Now, we're not going to do it perfect, but that's what we're aiming at, even through the highs and lows that you have. Does that make sense? Flip with me to the last page, page 42. I want to read this brief story from the book, which is on page 146 and 47. I'm jumping in at the word those. Those words echoed in my mind when I accompanied a distraught husband to his home to confess his failures to his wife. He had lost his job, spent his last dollar on diversions to make him forget, and returned home expecting his wife to add her scorn to the weight of his self-defeat. Instead, she told him that she loved him. He collapsed, sobbing, into a chair. Then, as I looked on, she placed a hand on his shoulder and for the next half hour reminded him of the good she loved in him. The words the wife spoke did as much to strengthen her heart as they did to rebuild the young man's self-respect. She told him how she admired his sensitivity and care for their children. She reminded him of the ways he made her laugh and of moments their family treasured. She listed the people who believed in him. Simply by recounting what she did respect in this terribly flawed man, the wife's eyes glistened with renewed love. He knew that he was undeserving of this kind of love. At one point, he objected to her words by saying, "I don't want you to love me so much." She responded simply, "God does." She gave her husband respect not only because he needed it, but because she knew God delighted in her doing so. What I want to point out to us as we wrap up for today is this. The gospel has to be our example in marriage. The way that you are called to love your spouse is according to the gospel of God's grace to you in Jesus. As God has loved you, even when you were entirely unworthy of that love, that same love is now to be shared from your heart to your spouse in the ebb and flow of daily life. That is why, as I said a few minutes ago, Christian marriage is such a beautiful and wonderful thing. Because it enables us to actually love each other when we struggle and when we fail and when we make mistakes. It enables us to keep going and to never quit on one another, even though we may go through seasons that can be very, very difficult. Now, think about the gospel with me just a little bit longer. Can people abuse God's radical kindness and grace in the gospel? God loving undeserving sinners saying, "Listen, through faith in my Son, I will give you every spiritual blessing in the heavenly places, complete cleansing, complete forgiveness, everlasting life, the promise of glory." Can people take advantage of that and abuse that? Yeah, and they do it all the time. And where those people really stand with God, only God can say. Yes, your spouse can do the same to you. You might say, "Well, what if I go home today and I show my spouse love and they just keep mistreating me? They just keep treating me bad and taking advantage of my kindness, taking advantage of my sacrifice." Well, God knows how you feel. God himself loves people who often do not return his love back to him. But the fact remains that grace is God's way. Grace is the way God changes hearts. Grace is the way God brings healing into broken people's lives. He gives them what they don't deserve, even though we frequently take advantage of him. Does that make sense? So when I'm saying to you, let the gospel be your example, I'm not saying, and as soon as you do, it's all going to be perfect. No, I can't promise that to you. I can promise you these two things, though. You will glorify God when you love your spouse this way, regardless of how they respond. And number two, you will have peace in your soul because you will know you are serving the Lord rather than shame in your heart, knowing you're dishonoring him just as much as your spouse is. We have to let the gospel guide us in our marriage and constantly be renewing our minds according to how God has loved us. And the last thing I have to say today before we break up into our groups for a few minutes, that's not my idea. What does Paul say about marriage in Ephesians 5? I tell you, this mystery refers to Christ and the church. By God's design, marriage itself exists to be a living picture or living illustration of the gospel. And that is why only when we begin to love our spouse according to the gospel can we really flourish in our marriages. All right, we're going to break up into groups for the last few minutes here. And here's our discussion question today, okay? And for those who are new, it'll be guys with guys, girls with girls, groups of around 4 to 5-ish. We're not really picky about that, but we try to keep it to where there's a small enough group that people can share and have time. Husbands, here's what you're going to do. You're going to answer the question together. What are specific ways that you can be more Christ-like in your love for your wife? And I'm hoping, men, that you can name at least 2 ways, specific ways. So generalities, we're not looking for those. We're looking for specifics. How this week can you specifically be more Christ-like in your love for your wife? Wives, what are specific ways that you can be more Christ-like in your respect for your husbands? Again, we're looking for specifics there as well. So let's break up into groups, and right around 6 o'clock, I'll close us in prayer.